that I'm really, I'm gonna say keying on. I know I said key at the beginning, but it's one little phrase in there. Is there not a cause? And I got 3 points that I want to bring from this. And the first one is there not a cause in trusting the Lord? And my second point is there not a cause in serving the Lord? And the last one is there not a cause for others to know there is a God? And I'm going to take it that a majority, everybody here, knows about David and Goliath, what happens on David and Goliath. I was teaching the kids this last Sunday, and I was telling Chloe, I said, I kind of like where you can teach, and the kids can get something from it, and the adults can get something from it. So it's a good balance there when you can teach kids stuff, and then I was talking to McKinley. I asked McKinley a question. I said about David's brothers. I said, what was the problem with David's brothers? And she shot that hand up and said, they were jealous over David. And I said, man, that made me feel good. I was like, whoo, them little kids back there throwing their hands up, answering questions and stuff, man, that'll make your heart happy right there. But the key verse here, I'm going to read some, probably some other text here. But in verse 29, David's talking to his brother, and after what his brother says to him here in verse 28, it says, Eliab, the eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why camest thou hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. And David said, what have I now done? Is there not a cause? So the cause is what? There's a giant. He's coming down in the camp. I know he's been coming, I think it's around 3 separate occasions that the Bible, I think it mentions here. And he presents himself one time, I know, for about 40 days. So there's a problem in the camp, and it's coming to Israel, and everybody's scared. So my first point here I want to hit is there not a cause in trusting the Lord? That, as I mentioned, the problem, Goliath. And we'll look here in verses 4 through 10, and it says, and there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, who was 6 cubits and a span. I believe this is around 9 foot and a quarter of a foot. So, I mean, it's a pretty big problem here in the camp. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. Look that up. It's around 125 pounds. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of a spear was like a weaver's beam, and a spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And one bearing a shield went before him. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am I not a Philistine, and ye servants of Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. And if he be able to fight with me to kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall you be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. So we know the solution here, and the solution is not David. But it's who David had, and more importantly, who had David. I say the biggest key part in here as you're looking, and I know I'm going to hit a couple points that I'm going to hit here in a little bit. And look in verse 11, it says, and when Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. I think it's verse 16 as well, talking about Goliath. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself for 40 days. I believe is verse 24. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. So if there's one thing that I can definitely see about the difference that David has and what is going on in Israel, what everybody else is what? Is the biggest part here is David actually believed God. David took God at his word and believed God. Everybody else, they were like, man, they looked at, I think the key, a big part of right here in these verses where it's talking out what Goliath is wearing, how Goliath is dressed, his height, it's in there for a reason. And I mean, honestly, if I'm looking at that, I'm like, man, we're about to get our butts handed to us. I played football. Man, I'm 5'7", 5'8". We played some teams up there, and I was like, everybody on that O-line's about 6'5". You looking at them, they all big boys, all muscled up. And I'm like, yep, Brent, pancake. I knew it. I ain't saying I didn't try. I put out, but man, they overpowered me, So, but I'm just saying, looking at it from my perspective, if I was back in this day, I'm probably going to side with everybody else. Man, Lord, you going to be able to do this, Lord? Or are you sure? You sure you're on our side for this one? But David, small boy, 16 or so, a little shepherd boy. And then he's trusting God. He says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? The Lord's going to smite him. The Lord's going to send somebody. The Lord he just wipe him out right there. And I like what David says here in the latter part. He says, when he's talking to Goliath, he says that the battle is the Lord's. It's all in the Lord's hands. It's just the fact that we have to go along with the Lord. We have to trust in what the Lord's going to do and that the Lord's going to provide. And that's the biggest step is, we can't see God. We can't see what God's going to do. And that scares us to the extent of, well, we have to step out. Oh, Lord, you going to be there for the next step? It's kind of like, I walk in the swamp and stuff, duck hunt and stuff like that. And man, I'm like, man, I got to cross this tree right here. My brother, he just, walks on across it, But me, I'm like inching across, about to fall back and forth. But God's bigger than what I'm just using that for an example, is that we have to trust the Lord and what He's going to do in our lives. It might fail, but it's all in the Lord's hands. Another part I'd like to say here is we're not the answer to the problem. I know we go out and we witness for the Lord. We try to bring others to the saving knowledge of Christ, and it's not us that's saving people. It's the Lord moving upon them through us to see that they're sinners and that they get saved. All we're doing, we're just the vessel that the Lord sent out. Praise God to that. And like I said, oftentimes, being honest, I find myself not believing that God can do it. And I get discouraged. And like I said in verses 11, 16, and 24, they're looking at how big they're looking at how big Goliath is. They're looking at this army, and they're believing that God's not going to provide for them. And it's just like in our walk, our Christian walk, is we run into something, and I'm sure everybody in here can have a testimony of when the Lord has provided them for something that and I think most of the time what we do is we don't give God the credit when credit is due. I can give an example. like for Chloe, I mean, she went to a couple of doctors and stuff, and they told her, you'd be lucky to conceive, So that's kind of discouraging. You can go to a doctor and stuff, and you're like, man, here's a new married couple. Probability of you having a child is pretty slim. The probability of her being able to keep the child is pretty slim. Man, God, you gonna be able to do this for us? But it's the trust God with it. I prayed about it, and I said, Lord, if you're sure will for us to have a child, then give us a child, Lord. But I'm not gonna get bitter with God and like, Lord, what about all this other stuff, Lord? You didn't do nothing for me there. It's in God's hands, and it's in God's will, and I want to walk in God's will that He's going to provide for me, and He's going to give me what I need, not everything I want. And I'm sure everybody in here can give a time or something, where, and I kind of want to refresh everybody, because everybody's got a time. If you say there ain't a time, I'm going to be like, well, are you really saved now, But I think everybody in here could give a testimony to the extent of, that was God in my life, and He did something for me. Another thing I want to look at and trust in the Lord is, the discouragement and how, I don't even want to give the devil credit when credit ain't due here, but our flesh will sometimes be our biggest enemy. In the extent of what Goliath's doing, he's presenting himself 40 days. And I was telling the young kids about this. I said, man, 40 days. I said, that's a month and 10 days. A whole month out of a year that Goliath, he's coming up to the camp for 40 days saying, give me someone to fight. Come on. I mean, y'all say y'all are on God's side. You're on God. You got God over here, and y'all can't send somebody against me. You think your God's gonna prevail against me? And Goliath for 40 days. I mean, man, can you imagine being on the front lines when that happens? Here comes, oh boy, here comes old big old Goliath. Wonder what he's gonna say today. The same thing he said for the past 39 days. And he's trying to make them question, where is your God? But it's, I got comfort here when I was reading this. I said, man, what's really calling out to me right now? I'm thinking about David. I'm thinking about a shepherd. And the first thing that crossed my mind was John 10. John 10, verses 11 through 15. Y'all ain't got to turn there for the sake of time and stuff. Probably should have called on somebody that turned there faster than me, though. What I have in my notes here, I believe it's 11 through 15. And Jesus Christ is speaking here, and He says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. But he that is a hireling, and not the shepherd, whose own sheep are not, seeth the wolf coming, and leaveth the sheep, and fleeth, and the wolf catcheth them, and scattereth the sheep. The hireling fleeth, because he is a hireling, and careth not for the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and know my sheep, and am known of mine. As the Father knoweth me, even so I the Father, and I lay down my own life for the sheep. So David's willingness here to go out to Goliath, and no doubt the Spirit of the Lord's removed from Saul and is now upon David. And I got something out of this now that I'm thinking about it here. But what Saul says, to all the men of Israel, because the Spirit of the Lord's been removed against Saul. And he's like, hey, someone go fight Goliath, because I'm not willing to do it myself. I'm going to use that for that hireling there. And in verse 25, this is what Saul says, and he says, "And the men of Israel said, Have ye seen this man that has come up surely to defy Israel? He has come up, and it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel." So with that context there, I'm saying that, Saul, he's not willing to go up against Goliath because he's scared that Goliath's going to prevail against him, because he don't have he don't have faith in that the Lord's going to provide. But David, I love David's response here when he's talking to Goliath and when he's talking to these men in the camp. He says, "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine," in verse 26, "that he should defy the armies of the living God?" I got to reading that, I'm like, boy, yeah, that's good stuff right there. And I'm going to finish that first point there, and trusting the Lord. Is there not a cause in trusting the Lord, and that the Lord will provide? Now my second point is there not a cause in serving the Lord? And I'm reading this text and stuff, and I'm looking at people, their stand on what they're seeing. They're seeing Goliath, they're seeing the problem in the camp and stuff, and they're not seeing God in the situation. And I got to thinking about this. God's willing to use anyone that's born again, but not everyone wants to be used. And like I was saying about, is there not a cause in trusting the Lord, is one of the biggest things that hinders us the most is our unbelief. Not believing that God can. And I like this. David, he's humbling himself, and sorry about that. And he wants God. I believe that during this time that David, I think this is just my thinking here, that David during this time he's watching over his father's sheep, and he's submitted to his father. He's obeying to his father, and I believe that he's in watching these sheep and stuff, and I believe he's praying during this time. Lord, I want to be used, Lord. And I think that's the biggest part to us is, Lord, use me, Lord. I want to be used. I want to be used for your glory. And then when the time comes, we don't put our feet down and we don't run. I think that's one of the biggest problems is, we want to be used, and then when the time comes, ooh, Lord, I didn't think you were going to actually answer that right there. I say that's probably one of the biggest problems right there, is that hinders our walk, is we don't believe that God can and God will. But I like what here in chapter 16 now, where Saul's, I'm going to use his king, the crown's been taken off of him. Use that. Now, I know it ain't taken off from him for another, I believe it's 15 years-ish. But I like what the Lord says to Samuel when he comes to the house of Jesse. In verse 7, he said, "But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance, nor on his height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart." And I'm watching this, and I'm like, man, David, he is who, like I was talking about here in verse 26. I look at 26, and that he should defy the armies of the living God. Who does he think he is, talking about our God? That the slandering of what this world will say about Jesus Christ. and that God's just searching for someone that's willing to be a vessel for him. And this vessel obviously was David, and David's love for the Lord and David's desire to be used of the Lord. In Christ, he's looking for someone who's obedient. I find this pretty unique here. David, even after he's anointed to be king, he's still, subject to his father. And what he says here, let's see. There's two times. It's verse 15. And David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And verse 17. And Jesse said unto David his son, take now thy brethren and ephah of this parched corn, and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren. So he's still obedient to his dad. The Lord's not going to use somebody that's in rebellion. That's the whole reason why Saul got the crown taken away from him, on his side. It's because of Saul's rebellion towards the Lord. And I'd like to key in the fact that what Saul was doing is not none of these big sins that we see today. Saul, there was no fornication, adultery, these outward sins. It was all sins of the spirit. And God, seeing Saul's heart and Saul's rebellious heart towards him, God's like, I can't use him, And obviously Samuel wants to see Saul get used, but the Lord's like, I've rejected him. It's, Samuel is over. I've rejected him. And that's what I wanted to point out is, there's a cause in serving the Lord, but we have to be obedient and willing to serve him. And I'd like to use this too. It's amazing to me how David, or how Christ used David here. This little old shepherd boy from Jesse here. A man that's, you think of a shepherd, you think of someone, that's a shepherd. He's dealing with sheep. He's tender, he's loving, he's watchful. And then to use him in the most crucial part in a war, that's something like mind-boggling to me, that Christ used someone like David, a young man, and used him in the most crucial part here for Israel. Because everything's on the line here. What Goliath says, in verse 9 he says, if he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. So in this cause of serving Christ is everything's on the line here, and to live it out. It's one thing to say, I trust the Lord, and then live it out. And that's what the world's looking at is, are you actually living it out? Are you professing? Are you showing, in your life? Now, I'm not saying works-based salvation or anything like that, but there's going to be definitely fruit behind it that, God's real and he's going to provide, and, I'm going to follow after him. And I think another thing here, and I know here it's in 1 Corinthians 1:21, for after that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God, but it pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. In the sense that we get to be a part of serving the Lord and witnessing. God could have used anything else that he wanted to witness, but he chose man. He chose He chose who, that we sinned against him. And he chose us to serve, like the given the chance, the ability to serve him. That's just an amazing thing there. And another thing I want to look at, and I know I'm starting to run out of time, but what David proved, what God allowed in David's life to help him for this exact moment. Verse 38 here, it says, and Saul armed David with his armor, and he put a helmet of brass upon his head, and he also armed him with a coat of mail, and David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. So, in this sense of, God's going to give you the ability to go out and to serve him, and he's going to provide so you can face this problem there. Let's see here, my notes. I'm going to use this here in verse 38. And Saul, I'm going to use this, the world here trying to equip you for what they think you need. But God, he puts off this excess baggage to go and to give David exactly what he's commanded him to do. I don't think it's a coincidence that David here, he slew this lion, he slew this bear, and he uses this when he's talking to Saul and says, that God's gave him, I'm going to use it, the practice there to go out and to defeat this Goliath, or this giant, this Goliath. And to see the wonderful hand of God, to see it at work, how David was faithful to the Lord, putting him in situations to walk by faith towards him. And the Lord, used him greatly. And now my last point here, is there not a cause for others to know there is a God? Verses 45 through 47. Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcass of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Verse 46 here, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Verse 47, for the battle is the Lord's. There's a cause so others can see. Can see God, so they can get saved. So and another thing is, so others that are discouraged in their walk, they can see. They see David, and they're like, man, David, he is going out. He is really trusting the Lord. Other people, they look on somebody that's walking, and then that's wanting to walk after the footsteps of the Lord, and they're like, well, if they can do it, I think the Lord will do it for me. And to see that, and then after the battle's over, after David has slain Goliath, I believe everybody was like, oh, he did it. He did it. This young man right here, he just killed the giant. Grab your swords, boys. We're going now. They're full steam ahead going after the Philistines. So somebody could be looking at your life here and see that you're walking with the Lord, and they have a desire to do the same. And David never did. I want to make this plain and clear as I can be. David never did any of this in his power. It was the power of the Lord. David didn't want the glory. Nobody knew who he was. But David, he knew how big God was and that he was bigger than any army. And my text here to show that nobody knew who David was is what Saul says to him. And he says, and the king said, "Inquire thou whose son the stripling is," in verse 56. And David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine. Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine. And Saul said to him, "Whose son art thou, thou young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of thy servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." And David knew that those who feared the Lord and believed on him, that God would provide. I mean, obviously, because you see David, he is, if I was in David's shoes, man, I'd be like, before I walk Goliath, I'm like, I look at this slingshot, I'm looking at him, he's holding a 15-pound, spearhead, and I'm like, Lord, is this going to work out? But David, he put his full trust, the Lord's going to do it. The Lord's going to do it. He's defied the Lord God, and God's going to slay him. It's not me, it's God. I heard this. He said if David would have threw that thing way over there, God would have put a GPS on that rock and still smacked him. I like to think about a boomerang. David would have flung that thing and said, well, he's still going to die. I'm just waiting on him. And that boomerang would have came back and smacked him in the back of the head, if anything. That God's going to provide. And I'm reminded another event that I've heard preached, and it's in Joshua 9, and it's the Gibeonites. I think about what could have happened here differently. If these Philistines, would have repented of their sin and came to the Lord. And what I'm talking about here, in the Gibeonites, they know what's happened in Jericho, and they know what's happened in Ai. And they heard about, Joshua, he's coming through, and he is wiping out everybody. So they know something's different. There's something different about Joshua and Israel. And, God's on them. And what happens here is the Gibeonites, they know what's happened to Jericho and Ai, like I said, and they came to Joshua, as sinners, as poor, broken, and they wanted mercy and grace, and they come to him, and I think it's like rags, and I think it's like old bottles, I think, and they plead with Joshua, Joshua, just give us mercy, and Joshua made peace with them. The Gibeonites, they know that there was something different about Israel and Joshua. That's because, again, God was on them. The fear of the Lord was moved upon the Gibeonites. And they repented of their sin and came into that, this God's real. This God is real. And that's the fear of the Lord. And and when they had that, they found mercy. They found mercy with God. And it's just like today, we can find mercy and grace today too. Once you see yourself as God sees you, and as, a poor old broke sinner, and, and you're like, man, I'm nothing. I'm just a sinner before the Lord. I deserve this wrath, and then, God's like, well, come to me, arms wide open, and I forgive you. And, that's the greatest part of salvation is, seeing that you're a sinner and the payment, Jesus Christ. And here again, I'm reminded here in John 6:37, all that the Father giveth me shall come to me, And him that cometh to me, I will in no wise cast out. And that's comfort knowing that Jesus Christ, he has me. And in Acts 4:12, neither is there salvation in any other, for there is none other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. Call upon the Lord Jesus Christ today, and you will be forgiven, and you'll be saved. And I just like looking at the life of David and how his pursuit of God, he was a man after God's own heart. And, that's a blessing just to see someone else, I'm reading here in the Bible that they pursued God, and then others see it happening, And I believe here it's a prime example of, people are watching you, and people are watching to see if your God's actually real. And that's a challenge for today. But that's all I have for you this morning. I hope it encouraged someone here. I know this text right here was definitely for me this morning. It was for me this week. So we'll close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for today.